Well, joining me now to discuss all this is Times Radio broadcaster and author Mariella Frostrup, ITV's political editor and author of The Crash, a thrilling new novel, Robert Peston, and author of The War on the West, Douglas Murray, over in New York. Let me start with you, Douglas, because I've not had the take yet from New York. What's the mood there? Because Russell Brand's a big name in America, big Hollywood star, of course, big media figure there as well. How has this gone down in America?
Well, you say he's big in America. He is famous, but he's not a big talent. His attempt to break Hollywood some years ago was a flop. Everyone recognizes that. And it's been argued that his more recent trajectory into the sort of fever swamps of conspiracy theory are a sort of result of that. He tried his career in the UK, he came to America to try to do it, it didn't work. And then he became this sort of self-appointed guru who most recently could be found on his YouTube channel claiming that the Maui fires were arguably started by BlackRock lasers, although there was no evidence for that, but there wasn't any evidence not for it either. I mean, this was for anyone unfamiliar with it, the territory that he had got himself into. So there's enormous interest in it, of course, as there is in all of these media stories. But it's not the case that he's regarded as any kind of talent.
Mariella, I read this report in the Sunday Times. Then I watched the Dispatches thing. I think you've got to do that to make any measured judgment about where we are with this. It seemed to me, with my former newspaper editor hat on, incredibly well-researched investigative journalism, obviously gone through many layers of fact-checking and legal work. But ultimately, in some of the cases, certainly, it will be a case of the word of the person making the allegations against Brandt, and he's vehemently denied any criminality here. Is it right that he should be unceremoniously cancelled by all these companies before we've really got to a conclusion on this?
Well, my greatest surprise, quite frankly, is that he's been allowed to broadcast for as long as he has, because if you look back at, some of the quotes from his delightful memoir, My Bookie Work, then you'll find extremely misogynistic, extremely unsavoury, and I would say in many cases alluding to an issue on his part with what is and isn't consensual
Well, it's interesting
sex.
you say that. So I found an interview I did with him in 2006, which is the same year, I think, that he was going out with this 16-year-old girl and picking her up from school. And it was a classic Brand interview at the time, where I asked, for reasons that I'm not entirely sure, other than it must have been jocular at the time, are you a more successful sexual predator now you don't drink? Now, I meant it as a joke. I didn't have any information about him actually being a sexual predator. He said, yes, but I resent the word predator. I like to think of myself as a conduit of natural forces. After all, the most natural thing in the world for people to do is to, he used a euphemism for having sex, and people want to do it. He said, so all you have to do is remove all the reasons why women don't actually go through with it, like pride and reputation. You just have to unpick the conditions stopping women going straight to bed with you. And then he said this, to your point. I asked him if he was attracting more women since becoming a celebrity. He said, actually, all that's changed is the amount of seduction required has decreased to almost preposterous proportions now I'm famous. I've always been good at pulling because I'm quite charming, but if I talked to 10 women in the old days, then I'd back myself to pull 2 or 3. Now I wouldn't be happy with less than 8 or 9. And whereas I would have devoted a lot of time to seduction depending on the quality of the target, now I just get on with it. Fame has been very helpful in that respect. Now, these are damning
but I think, Piers,
quotes, right?
But that's a damning question as well, if you don't mind saying.
Yeah.
Because if you can say to him, as a joke question, that you're a more successful sexual predator now that you don't drink, then actually what it reflects is a culture where it's acceptable to make jokes about things that are incredibly serious.
I totally agree.
And that, for me, is the biggest issue with all of this. If criminal proceedings go ahead and if he's found guilty, that's a completely separate thing, and I'm not in any way qualified to talk about that. But certainly as a woman who's been in the public eye for the last 35 years, the atmosphere and the ability for people to use their power and to promote themselves in a certain way and to discuss and laugh about things that really aren't funny, I think began in the kind of mid-90s with all those lad magazines.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Of course, we saw what happened with the thing with Jonathan Ross, with with the young woman, Georgina Bailey, was on my show last night talking about the effect that had on her life. Robert, he goes on to say, he boasts endlessly about the number of women he's slept with and so on, but he goes on to say that he treats women as goddesses. He never wants to be misogynistic or aggressive towards women. He kind of qualifies it all, as he's often done, leaving you sort of wondering, well, what is the real Russell Brand here? And maybe from these investigations we are finding out the sinister reality, but maybe we're not. I mean, I do think if you believe in due process, if you believe in the law doing its job, it is too early to convict him.
So look, I'm sure contributors to your show, Piers, believe in due process. But on the other hand, there have been more than rumours. It's been a sort of open secret in parts of the media for years. This character was seen by women who he'd had relationships with as abusive. And I mean, my partner, Charlotte Edwards, wrote in The Standard a few years ago about, what an appalling man he was in terms of his relationships with women. And she was responding, actually, curiously, to a Sunday Times interview with him in which he'd said he'd become a great supporter of Me Too. And, I mean, this was this was like an insult, really, but there wasn't the outrage you would have expected. So, I mean, many would say, yes, it's great that Channel 4 and the Sunday Times have done an important investigation about how an individual seems to have abused his power as a result of his fame. But you slightly ask yourself, why weren't they doing this year? Why was he being given respectability over many years? Why was the investigation, in a sense, so late?
But also more so, I mean, it's interesting, that Charlotte writes this article, but actually he's written far more damning things
including in this
people have
interview,
written about him.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at these quotes from my bookie work, by my 20s I would relish the challenge of chaste maids and the search for the correct combination of words required to decode their moral resistance, the knobstacle course, I call it. As I escorted Michaela, a lap dancer who slapped him after sex, through the front door, I felt very strongly that I needed to avenge the slap. I spat in her face. That's in his words, in his book.
Totally. And I do think, one of the things that all of the media, both from tabloid to sort of broadsheet and indeed television, everybody has questions to answer here because everybody lent him respectability in different ways.
Platform.
I mean, the Newsnight interview, where he's taken, this is a man whose ideas are absurd, and yet, the BBC gives him a platform as though he's some great thinker.
He was invited to Parliament to talk about drug law.
Well, Ed Miliband basically had him trying to prop up his effort to be Prime Minister.
Because there's this ridiculous idea that somehow he has this connection with young people.
The Guardian had him... I mean, Alan Rusbridge has been very pompous about this on Twitter and very highfalutin. He had him next to him in the Guardian editorial conference, sitting next to Rusbridger, and basically dictating what was going to happen in the paper.
So I think how you legitimise somebody, how you give them respectability, how you give them this cloak which allows them to do some really terrible... I think, there are questions for everybody.